I'm happy to be talking to you from Freemasons Hall here in Edmonton. It's one of our great historic locations. Yeah, it's being surrounded by high-rise condos. I don't no idea who's going to be living in those condos. But this is certainly a great social institution if you look back at the city's history. The Freemasons were literally brickmasons, and they would organize themselves in lodges. These days we might call them unions. So it was a way of networking, transferring information, gaining knowledge. It's amazing the sort of development that the Scottish population of this town did for Edmonton. And I know that's a specific slice of history that's apart from Indigenous history. It's apart from our history now. But this particular slice I find pretty fascinating. Okay, Roland Lyons was a prominent city architect. He posted a note on his office door. His office was in the Canada Permanent Building, 100th Street. Temporarily closed for the war. Will be back when the war ends in a couple weeks. He never returned. My name is Daryl Babick. I'm the principal of Boreas Architecture and Civic Design, Inc. here in Edmonton. The focus of my practice, we preserve stories of Canadian heritage and achievement. Everything that comes through my office is an existing building. Most of those, virtually everything that crosses my desk, is an historic project that tells a story about the history of this city and this province. I was doing quite a bit of work for the school board over at Westmount School, restoring a lot of the millwork inside. The principal walking in the door once just dared me, bet you can't fix this. So there was this grotesque, it's like a gargoyle, except it has no function. It was we think it's some sort of a hound, a wolf maybe. Midway down, it was missing a snout. Oh, don't dare me like that. So we found a way to work with the Parent-Teacher Association to raise funds for it. I had a material scientist in the office. He sourced the stone. The stone was basic Indiana limestone. We used scraps from the Royal Alberta Museum project. He came up with cost-benefit analysis for different pin types. We did a Dutchman repair. So we carved a socket, if you will, in the base stone, and we just put in a new block. Okay, and then from that, we came up with a mortar mix recipe that matches limestone, so it expands and contracts the same way. It's not going to crack. Just by chance, the head carver of Stavanger Cathedral in Norway was in town because his grandmother lives in Westlock, and she was celebrating her 100th birthday. So we offered him some extra money just to stick around and carve this thing.
The building was constructed in it was opened in 1960, and until about 1983 or 4, it remained a planetarium, a very popular planetarium, and it was the first planetarium in Canada. But then the TELUS World of Science built their other planetarium. Douglas Cardinal was the architect, then the building went into decline. It was only used for storage and that sort of thing, and it was in serious jeopardy. But the significance of the building is such that the city was convinced that restoring the building was a worthwhile thing to do. By designating it, that's going to protect it. The city has leased it back to the TELUS World of Science, and the TELUS World of Science is very happy to be using the building again to extend their programs, their planetarium programs, especially for children, because it's a smaller planetarium than the big one. My name is David Murray, and I graduated from the University of Toronto in 1969. I grew up in Ontario, but I immediately moved out here, and so I've only practiced architecture in Alberta, in Edmonton, actually. And I worked on a number of projects up until 1984 when I opened my own office. And my own office has developed a specialty in conservation architecture. Maintaining the historic buildings means that you're maintaining the value of the historic district, and otherwise it gets eroded over time. Old Strathcona has been eroded to a large extent anyway over time, but there's enough history there, enough commitment by building owners to maintain the original historic character of the neighborhood. So every time a developer like Beljan, for instance, buys a historic building, designates it and restores it, that actually is improving the neighborhood.
But I mean, the buildings in Edmonton have great stories. The Revillon building. We just finished a project there to restore the exterior. Frère Revillon was a very, very ritzy Parisian department store. And they had stores in Paris, London, Munich, Vienna, Moscow, New York, Montreal, and Edmonton. Edmonton was their fur trade capital. And the building that's there was sited where it is because on the alley, which is now that atrium, there was a railway siding. And they had their own railway cars that they used for promotion. You know, you'd see this line of railway cars from Frère Revillon coming to Edmonton. You could expect to see fancy new merchandise there. And Edmonton was the center of the fur trade, so they would take furs out. Apparently, Frère Revillon would accept payment in either cash or fur. How Canadian. So Frère Revillon moved out of the building in the 30s. In 1949, I believe it was, 48 or 49, there was a huge fire in the building. The building was pelted with water for 2 days straight, and it caused a complete reorganization of the Edmonton Fire Department. But after the building had this fire is when the building was painted. So it was all lead-based paint. Perhaps I was scared that it was covering some sort of fire damage. This lead-based paint was beginning to peel and sprawl, so it was a public health hazard. So the paint had to come off the building, but because Edmonton bricks are very soft, a brick is a lot like a crusty loaf of bread. They're both dust mixed with water and baked. So if you feature baking that loaf of bread in a cool oven, my grandmother baked in a cool oven, she would call it a warm oven versus a smart oven or a very smart oven. Okay, Medicine Hat had natural gas kilns. They had very smart ovens. Okay, you got hard bricks that way. Edmonton, we used local coal, which didn't burn as hot. So you find soft bricks. And we were experimenting a lot with that building because everything we were trying to peel paint off that building was also damaging the brick and peeling the fire face, because that crust on a loaf of bread or brick, cut it off, squish it. Yeah, it's squishy now. So we had to keep the fire face on the brick. And that in itself was quite a project. That and at the corner of 102nd Avenue and 104th Street, there are 4 limestone columns. And I noticed that they were covered in this white powder that went about 7 feet up from the sidewalk, some sort of efflorescence, that's called. We had no idea what it was. That materials scientist in my office, I do not recommend that people do this. Do you know what he did to figure out what it was? Don't do that. Don't go around licking columns downtown, okay? No, it was just simple sodium. But anyway, we did a Dutchman repair on those as well.
The Alberta Hotel building was a really interesting situation. The city rediscovered that they had all the remains of the demolition of the Alberta Hotel. We were involved in a little competition which required the entire site to build Canada Place. When they built Canada Place, they tore down the Alberta Hotel, but they did it carefully and kept all of the pieces, including the cupola, all of the interiors of the bar, all of the original brick. And then for 30 years it sat there with nobody doing anything about it, and everyone had forgotten about the remnants. And suddenly, when the city came along and rediscovered them, they asked us, because of our history with historic buildings, whether we would be interested in using the artifacts and remnants of that old building. And so we looked for a location, and the location we found was almost exactly the original location of the Alberta Hotel. And it's just the Alberta Hotel moved over 15 feet to accommodate Canada Place. So then they had turned it incidentally into a park, and there was some reaction, some people very negative about putting the hotel back because it was destroying their park. So there was a bit of controversy there, and but eventually it was built, and I think it fits in perfectly, creates a very interesting synergy between the Canada Place, which is brick, and the Alberta Hotel and the Citadel. And I think it's worked well. It's now been taken over by CKUA, and that was a perfect use for it. Hopefully they can afford to stay there. My name's Gene Dubb, and I'm an architect here in Edmonton, and I've done various other things, some development. I even took a shot at politics, but primarily I'm an architect.
A question that I'm often asked is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of designating a historic property, whether it be a house or a commercial building or something like that? And I've had the experience of working on projects where there was a resistance to designation, and we could only go so far because they had limited funds. One was a beautiful church, the First Presbyterian Church on 105th Street. Later on, the board thought that they would reconsider that decision, not to designate it as a municipal historic resource. It was always already designated as a provincial historic resource, but the funding from the province is fairly limited. The funding from the city can be much more substantial, but it only happens one time at the very beginning of the designation process. So we went through that process, and it turned out to be a great advantage and absolutely no disadvantage to them at all. And they received a substantial amount of money from the city towards the restoration of the building. I just want to commend the city for its heritage program, really. They started in 1993 with a citywide inventory that identified at that time a select number of maybe around 400 or so of the city's most important historical buildings. It's been enlarged immensely since then. We have a really good idea of what's valuable in this city from a heritage point of view. And then the city developed this very lucrative grant program to assist people with designation and restoration of their buildings, whether it be a single family house or a commercial building or a church. And it's been very beneficial. There are just hundreds of designations now.
For the amount of carbon and energy that it took to build that building in the first place, for the amount of carbon and energy that it would take to demolish that building, and then for the amount of carbon and energy it would take to build something new on that site, which Lord knows the way this city works, we're probably going to rip it down in 50 years anyway and do it all over again. That makes no sense that way. In terms of money, No, it is. And various studies, especially the American Institute of Architects right now, came out with a variety of studies showing that it's far less expensive to simply maintain and rehabilitate, perhaps restore existing buildings, add on to them, build around them. It's even possible to build on top in many instances, or to build some sort of a cantilevered foundation off to the side if we need to go high. But for all of the onus there is in this city to build taller and taller and taller buildings in hopes that we will look like a big city, I will very quickly point out that the 1912 Civic Plan of Edmonton would have had Edmonton look like Washington, D.C., which caps all of its buildings at 8 floors. Washington, D.C. is a far larger and economically, you could argue, more important city than Edmonton. There's no reason for us to be building tall buildings here.
There was the closest thing we came to an Edmonton style was when Doug Cardinal started to try and get sort of a prairie architecture and indigenous architecture. And it was clearly different in that it avoided straight lines and right angles. Unfortunately, very interesting philosophy of architecture, of living, but the world hasn't gone in that direction. The world has gone in a more practical and some people would say realistic direction, and that's the international look that I'm talking about.
When I first moved back, what struck me were the vacant gravel parking lots downtown that had wild jackrabbits going through them. And it reminded me of this book that I used in my thesis, 34 Los Angeles Parking Lots it was a Beatnik era artist, Ed Rushka. And all it was aerial photographs of 34 famous parking lots in Los Angeles. And I was pitching this around town. I could do an exhibit of 34 empty parking lots in Edmonton within a 5-block radius of downtown. Yeah.
The conservation issues can be multiple. I can think of examples where we had to replace the foundation. Almost always do we have to replace the roof. There can be structural damage in the building, and we often have to remove some of the aspects of the building that have been added over the years, so we restore it back to its original appearance. Those are the kinds of issues that we would be facing. Occasionally I have to rebuild portions of it. One house over in Oliver had been converted. It was a single-family house, and it had been converted to commercial use. And owners came in and wanted to return it to a single-family house. And so the challenges they faced where the porch on the front wasn't the original porch that had been on there, but we had excellent photographs of that. So they agreed we're going to rebuild the original porch that was on there. So it matches exactly the historic photographs that we had. They had to replace the foundation, so they had to lower the basement on the house so that they could build a bedroom suite in the basement. Then they had to build new foundations to support the building, and then a lot of restoration work on the inside on moldings and doors and windows and things like that.
Every city goes through a period of maturation. Want to feel this sort of newness, greatness, and keep building bigger and bigger and bigger things. Does Edmonton suffer a second city attitude? Perhaps. I can recall, this is great, at the consulate in Chicago, there was a reception to celebrate the inauguration of nonstop jetliner service between Edmonton and Chicago, and the city of Edmonton sent a delegation down to celebrate, led by a mayor whose name shall remain anonymous, so you can probably figure out who it is. So he made a spiel. And in the middle of his spiel, he said, and a recent survey just showed that Edmonton was ranked as the 5th most livable major Canadian city. And all of his henchmen got up, wildly cheered and applauded, and a bunch of Americans tapped me on the shoulder afterwards and asked, how many major Canadian cities are there? Okay, Edmonton, there's no reason why we have to suffer from a second city attitude. No, we are fine the way we are. Many times people will want to compare us with Calgary, which has an exceptionally, and these days it's toned down a lot, but compared to other major cities in North America, even Chicago, it had an exceptionally vibrant downtown. And Edmonton isn't quite that. Well, no, we're a different city. A very different city, very different flavor, and that's fine. That is us. We can celebrate that.
I really hope that our downtown is revitalized. I think to me, that's the number one thing we should be working on, is to bring our full downtown, all of it, everything from, 95th Street all the way to 109th Street and all the way from 105th Avenue to the river. That entire bigger definition of downtown needs to be fully revitalized. So streetscape, walking paths, bike paths, trees, parks, the whole urban domain, right? The whole public domain just needs to be completely rebuilt with a lot more attention to the pedestrian experience. And it's everything from how the traffic lights work. I mean, it's little things, right? Pedestrian experience is can you make it across the street on a light, on a walk light? Well, you can in some intersections if you're quick, but if you're walking with the cane, maybe not so much, right? So I think we can reimagine our entire downtown as a walkable city and just think about it from a pedestrian perspective and from a cyclist's perspective, and, be less focused on the needs of the cars and the miles of surface parking. I think the other thing we could do, and I think many cities have done this actually, Edmonton hasn't, but it's really quite easy, is just to say no more surface parking. That's it. So parking has to be on the street or underground, and that's all. No surface parking lots. And those surface lots have to be redeveloped. And it's funny, you go into some cities. I remember years ago being in New Orleans, for example, and there were all these old warehouse buildings. We used to have tons of them here. Now we have a few left. But they were all being used as parking structures. And why? Well, because the city had a tax rate that was much cheaper if you kept an old building and much higher if you had a vacant land. Here we have the opposite. The taxes are very low if you have vacant land and very high if you have an empty building. And so there's an incentive in our current system to tear down buildings. And you see it, like the old Bank of Montreal building was torn down and the older Bank of Montreal building was torn down. And like these are all buildings that were perfectly fine, but they've been torn down in the last 5 to 10 years for, just because it's more economic for the owner to pay less taxes. And I get it, but if the city changed the tax regime, it would be quite easy to flip that and not incent people tearing down buildings, and just allow them to stay empty until such time as a new use is found. And yeah, use them for parking, use them for something else, but don't allow surface parking. Those are all public policy things that the city could do that would make a really big difference to the quality of life in our downtown. And I think downtown is the number one issue. If we can't fix downtown in the next 10, 15 years, then we're going to have a really hard time being a significant city going forward. I'm Vivian Manask, Principal Architect at Reimagine Architects.
Jasper Ave, from my understanding, historically was a street that, was very busy, interesting. I don't know if it happened in the redevelopment in the 70s where a lot of the heritage architecture was pulled down for something they thought was new and better at the time, but it certainly didn't help the street. White Ave is a street that has lots of interesting aspects to it. But again, I think, especially even after COVID, you've noticed that a number of shops closed down. It's starting to pick up life again. I live off 124th Street. I moved there because I thought it had potential, and that's 20 years ago. And there's still a lot of pockets that need to be filled in before that can have strong connectivity all the way through.
Well, certainly, it's a more sustainable approach if you're able to preserve a building. You do what you can to maintain it and have it viable as long as possible, and that helps the environment. You try to make it more energy efficient as well. But I think in terms of expressing our culture, and capturing what was important to society at a certain time when it was built. I think it's like a history lesson. You can walk through a cityscape and see the building from maybe 1940 and see, well, this is how people conducted their banking at that time, or this is the seat of government at that time, and you can appreciate that. If you tore every building down after so many years, you would only have you'd have a cityscape that really has no real age. You wouldn't be able to tell where it's from, what was important at a certain time that it was built. It's always moving forward. It's hard to imagine that, except for certain cities that were all designed at one time, and they do lack that historical character, that cultural expression that that's important to identify a certain place. My name is Croy Yi. I'm an Edmontonian. I was born here. I had my architectural academic training in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba, and I've been practicing architecture for probably about 40 years.
I'm Ian Evans. I'm a partner with HSCA. We've been in Edmonton in business for about 17 years. We have a staff of 30 people, and we do the gamut of architectural projects within the city. We do everything from light industrial, commercial retail, multifamily, student residence at the U of A, and more recently we do adaptive reuse, which we've been doing quite a bit of. Part of the problem is you need people there 24 hours a day, and places like Toronto, which I lived in for quite a long time. It's only in recent history, in the last 20 years, where there's been a real focus of bringing residents back into downtown, and that's had an explosive effect to the streetscape and the kind of, they always had their communities where there was lots of interesting, what I would call urban life happening, but that's just increased exponentially. So I think bringing residents downtown, which is starting to happen, will certainly help. There's a lot of pockets, there's a lot of parking lots downtown, which would be nice if they filled in. It's hard to tell. Obviously, the ICE district was created with the thought that that could be a center and a hub to downtown. It certainly does during the finals of hockey. And then there's the stuff we're doing as well within neighborhoods, like Oliver Exchange is one of them. We're doing another project in Ritchie where you don't necessarily have to model urban development after sort of traditional methods like streetscapes, linear streetscapes, where you can build a hub where maybe a single building or a collection of buildings that house unique local entrepreneurs, and they can coexist in smaller spaces in a synergistic way where they're self-supporting, and naturally they become a draw for the community. And that's, again, reintroducing the ability to walk to these things as opposed to getting in your car and going someplace. So it maybe has to happen at that level, and that concept expands. I've always wanted a greengrocer on 124th Street, because I remember being in Toronto, just being able to walk a few blocks and pick up everything, right? A little shop, and it had virtually everything. We don't have that. You have to ride your bike or drive. When I have been downtown Calgary, I have felt that there's more heritage buildings down there, but then there's also just a more concentration of people, uses, offices, businesses. Edmonton is fairly spread out. They always say we're more of a blue-collar city, which means that there's a lot of industrial on the periphery, and that provides the support for people, the jobs and whatever else. So I definitely think in those empty parking lots, rebuilding residential, and then also in a mixed-use capacity, I think will certainly help. But aside from that, I don't know. The city's building a big urban park. Will that help regenerate development around it? There is some development that's happening right now. It's a huge park, so that may help. Well, mixed-use developments are interesting because generally they're in more urban settings because there's a retail component on the ground floor, typically, with residential above. Mercury Block was a project that it was a new client for us, and so we had presented some ideas about a vision for that site, and it inspired the client to continue with us. And so in dealing with the client, unfortunately, our vision, it's in the Oliver area. I know Oliver has a new name. But that neighborhood, there's a lot of infill happening. There's lots of density there. And there was an opportunity here for us to create a front yard. So there'd be the commercial aspect, there'd be the residential, but creating a ground floor amenity seemed really important to us in a way that would invite the community into the space as well as be an amenity for the residents. The client, this was Autograph, was very interested in that concept, but they needed the density for the site to make the project work. So with them, we came up with a concept where there was the density, but we created a porous ground level so that it would open up to the street and there'd be an internal courtyard within the space. And this was interesting because it allowed for an entrance that wasn't a residential entrance that wasn't necessarily on the street. It was set into the courtyard, so it invited people into the space, as well as it allowed a double-sided retail food and beverage opportunities to happen, such that they had a street front facade, but they also had one to the internal courtyard. So there was the ability for more active frontage along the street, and then a more intimate, say, weather-protected space on the interior. Well, mixed use just allows for a combination of uses within a single site. It doesn't always make sense because, for example, on 124th Street, there's only so much retail that a city can provide, right? And so we've had projects where by the zoning it had to be commercial on the ground floor and it was residential above, but it just didn't make sense in that area. They couldn't lease the space. And so after a number of years of just being empty, and it's not great to have empty storefronts, the city finally relented and allowed it to be residential. But in places where it does work, it just adds additional vibrancy to both, the community that currently exists, but then also the new residents that'll be part of the development. I think we're going in a good direction. Certainly, I can't speak to other places because we don't do a lot of work in other places. But the city, with its new zoning bylaw, I think, for one, it's going to help create more density in other areas, allow for different opportunities to happen. Hopefully that will allow for a mixture of uses within those areas, so it's not such a blanket zone for different locations like single-family home, residential, or industrial. There's the ability to mix up program in interesting ways. But I think the city itself generally has been very easy to work with, and particularly on Mercury Block, where there were some challenges there. There was a group at the city that did help the client and help us deal with the process of rezoning and then just any other issues that came up, whether it was transportation or EPCOR or anything else. So, they were very helpful.
Edmonton will keep growing. Alberta's a growing province, a growing economy. We are the gateway to the north. I keep wondering why on earth we don't have east-west access going across northern Canada. That would make sense, and Edmonton certainly is well positioned to be the gateway for that. We will continue probably to be this blue-collar lunch bucket town. That's fine. That's our identity. Build on it. A lunch bucket town with all sorts of universities. I just described Boston. We could be a Boston. We could be in Austin, Texas, which is even a state capital. We got to get it out of our mind that we need to be like another city. We can be Edmonton. Being Edmonton's just fine.
It's going to be interesting to see what this whole concept of sustainability, greenhouse gas, and what effect that will have on buildings. But I think it will be a universal movement. Buildings will suddenly have a lot of solar collectors throughout the world. They may take a slightly different form in Edmonton versus Texas, where the solar panels might be facing a different direction. But I think that the movements now are international.
Well, in terms of buildings, and that's a scale that I'm involved with, I see Edmonton's future will have more interesting and important buildings. But that's a general trend I see for every city, in North America at least, or if not the world. I know there's a number of iconic buildings in Calgary, and our city is also has been trying to raise the standard of the buildings that they directly have control over, where they have the control over the program and the budgeting and the funding. But other than that, I think the city also has a direction in terms of preventing urban sprawl, and they're trying to increase the density of the central part of the city through development bylaws, and I think that's a good thing. You probably have the same experience. You mentioned walking downtown and seeing parking lots, and if they were to become medium-rise, high-rise developments with mixed use, commercial or some other functions that would just generate traffic. I think that bodes well for the city, the Edmonton of the future. I think everyone's afraid of urban sprawl, except the person who wants to move out to the suburbs to get away from everyone. So that's the way I see it. I don't see drastic changes coming to Edmonton. I think our leaders are doing a reasonably good job of trying to keep the efficiencies of the systems that run the city, at the same time allow for varied and interesting development. And there's a recognition that people want to preserve important buildings that we have as well.